When Hitler surprised the world in 1941 by invading the USSR, his former allies in Europe, it soon became clear that there were more reasons behind the invasion than just war strategy. Nazis had a special hatred for the Russians. They considered them lesser men and women not only because they were Slavs and thus racially inferior, but also because they were Bolsheviks and Hitler hated their communist doctrine. Since the ascent of the Nazi Party to power in Germany in 1933, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda portrayed the Soviets as destroyers of civilization, puppets of the Jewish interests, weak and underdeveloped. It comes to no surprise, then, that German soldiers treated the Soviet prisoners worse than the rest, except maybe for the Jews. Join us today as we look into what happened to Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans, one of the darkest chapters of World War II. Operation Barbarossa, the first 6 bloody months. In its scale, fanaticism, and sheer criminality, Nazi Germany's war against the Soviet Union has few rivals in the history of armed conflict. When Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, it came as a big surprise to both Stalin and the Allied powers. After all, they had been in good terms until recently, and even signed a pact of non-aggression in 1939. Nonetheless, Germany ordered their troops to invade the neighboring nation and to charge against Moscow, in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. The Eastern Front became, in the next years, the cruelest battleground of World War II. In the European theatres, it was the war on the Eastern Front that generated by far the largest numbers of prisoners and the largest number of deaths. The brutal nature of the Barbarossa campaign in 1941 and the 4 years of warfare that followed have been well documented, and historians debated about the origins and escalation of this war of annihilation, a conflict that led to the mass killing of millions of soldiers and civilians between 1941 and 1945. During the conflict, it has been estimated that German forces took approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers into captivity. Of these, some 3.3 million did not survive the war. What is more, these figures take no account of troops who may have attempted to surrender, but who were killed on the battlefield before their existence as prisoners could be recorded. This represents an appalling level of mortality that, at around 57%, is out of all proportion to the losses suffered by other nationalities in German hands. This was in part because the German troops were encouraged to see ordinary Russians as culturally inferior and used to harsh conditions, albeit capable of good work if properly led. Also, because Hitler's attack on Russia was based on several incorrect assumptions, according to his racist ideology. First, Hitler took the inferiority of the Russian people for granted and assumed their military leadership was still in turmoil after the Stalinist purges of the late 1930s, and unlikely to be stronger by the time of the putative German attack in 1941. His military commanders considered that the Red Army posed no offensive threat, but conceded the toughness and courage of individual Soviet soldiers and their potential to mount successful defensive actions. In addition, there was no question that this was also going to be an ideological war, a struggle between Nazi Germany and a Judeo-Bolshevik Soviet Union for primacy in Europe and for living space. This was to be a war of annihilation and of extermination, concepts that were built into the planning process through a series of decrees published during the spring of 1941. Hitler's decrees were intended to cement in the minds of the ordinary soldiers and their officers that this was to be a very different type of war, one where they would be participating in an ideological conflict alongside the SS and with the full agreement of their military commanders. The elimination of real or imagined enemies behind the lines was a measure to spare German blood, but this was only one element in the process. Hitler's utterances, orders from army commanders, and stories of treachery by the Red Army all helped to build this image, as did Stalin's own portrayal of the war not as ordinary, but as a people's war against German fascism. Despite all this hatred and the intense propaganda against the Russians on August 23, 1939, Hitler's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joachim von Ribbentrop, signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, represented by Vyacheslav Molotov. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was kept secret and stipulated that both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany would respect the other party's spheres of influence in Europe, and that they would not attack each other for 10 years since the signing. Soon after, Hitler invaded Poland and World War II started. At first, he kept a cautious alliance with Stalin on account of the mutual interests in the war. But when France fell in just 6 weeks and the only real threat to the Third Reich came from the battered United Kingdom, Hitler gave the order to start Operation Barbarossa and betray his former ally. During the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, between June and December 1941, the German armed forces claimed to have taken approximately 3,350,000 Soviet prisoners. However, the facilities intended to hold the prisoners of war in the Eastern Front were totally inadequate to house such a large number of inmates, and the rations sent by the central German government were not enough to feed everyone. In some cases, local communities took pity of the languishing Russians and volunteered to feed the prisoners. In many cases, such help was refused, either formally or informally, with the guards shooting any civilians approaching the camp. Even when some camp commanders did allow the delivery of food supplies, these were often pillaged or confiscated by the guards or the camp police and never reached the intended recipients. Soviet prisoners were deprived of even the most basic human rights. In general terms, it seems that neither the frontline units nor the guards ordered to move the prisoners to rear areas felt any great responsibility for their welfare, and this neglect was only exacerbated when the captives finally arrived at a designated collection point. The so-called summer camps consisted of huge barbed wire enclosures whose area was determined by the supposed number of prisoners to be accommodated. There were no buildings or provision for latrines, in other words, no protection from the elements or from the dangers of disease. Supply areas were also enclosed by fences, but facilities were crude in the extreme. A report in August on an army prisoner collection point with 11,000 men in its compound found that there was no provision for drinking water or any cooking facilities, and that camp organization was chaotic. Brutality and incessant shooting seemed to be the main methods of control. The degradation was made complete by the absence of any sanitary facilities, and 2 huts were the only provision for the many sick and wounded. During the first months of Operation Barbarossa, starvation was the primary cause of prisoner mortality. The second cause was being shot by the guards, who did not face any repercussions for this barbaric practice. Anti-Soviet propaganda in the Third Reich. In order to understand the extreme cruelty that the Soviet prisoners faced in the hands of the German soldiers and officers, we must look at the stories and lies that were fed to the general population by the Reich's propaganda ministry. On the 8th September 1941, 2.5 months after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Third Reich issued a normative called Regulations for the Treatment of Soviet Prisoners of War in All Prisoner of War Camps. It stated that Bolshevism, the destroyer of nations, was the deadly enemy of Nazi Germany, and for the first time, the German soldier was being confronted by a trained enemy, both militarily and politically. Thus, the Russians could not be considered or treated as honorable soldiers. The German soldier needed to use all means at his disposal in the struggle. This meant ignoring the international laws that prescribed the ethical treatment of the captured soldiers, like the Hague or Geneva Conventions. Of course, this propaganda had started much earlier in Nazi Germany, practically since the Nazi Party existed, and especially since it came to power in 1933. And since that moment, propaganda against the Soviet Union became one of the main objectives of Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. That same autumn, Eberhard Taubert, one of Nazi Germany's most prominent anti-Semites and among the first members of the Nazi Party, founded the so-called anti-Comintern within the Ministry of Propaganda. The real Comintern, the Communist International, was the international workers' organization completely controlled by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The main objective of Taubert's anti-Comintern was to administer an anti-Soviet propaganda campaign in the whole territory of the Third Reich. One of the main ways in which Taubert made the Germans hate the Soviet people was to associate Bolshevism with the Jews. This way, they only had to concentrate on one single enemy, the international threat of Judeo-Bolshevism, despite the fact that traditionally Jews were discriminated against in the former Russian Empire and also in the Soviet Union. Taubert's propaganda was so intense that the whole German nation was convinced that there was a world Jewish conspiracy against the German state, which was orchestrated by Joseph Stalin in Moscow. Posters appeared on the walls of every German city portraying a caricaturized Stalin planning to destroy the German Reich, and it became common to see in state-sanctioned media the hammer and the sickle superimposed over a David's cross. Another common image was that of a red hand of communism reaching over to the German map, signifying that the Red Menace was going to invade Germany if they did not stop them. Between the summer of 1939 and the spring of 1941, when the Third Reich and the USSR agreed to an uneasy truce, the anti-Bolshevik propaganda was halted. Joseph Goebbels officially dissolved the anti-Comintern and concentrated the efforts of his ministry on the British enemy. This had to change with the German aggression against the USSR. After the attack on the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, Goebbels realized that it was time to return to making anti-Bolshevik propaganda. The propaganda ministry had to rally the concerned German public for the war against the USSR. It soon became apparent that the wartime propaganda was more than a mere repeat of the anti-Soviet campaign of the late 1930s. As Nazi Germany's propaganda again emphasized a global Jewish conspiracy against the German nation, the anti-Bolshevik rhetoric became a part of a discourse that served to legitimize the World War and the Holocaust. In the Eastern Front, however, Nazi propaganda acted in new ways. According to Nazi ideology, the Russians and other Slav peoples were useless subhumans. As such, their leaders, the Soviet elite, were to be killed and the remainder of the population enslaved or expelled further eastward. As a result of these racist fantasies, millions of Soviet civilians were deliberately killed, starved, or worked to death. Millions of others were deported for forced labor in Germany or enslaved in the occupied eastern territories. German planners called for the ruthless exploitation of Soviet resources, especially of agricultural produce. This was one of Germany's major war aims in the East. For this reason, Stalin enforced a scorched earth policy to deny the Germans and their allies basic supplies as they advanced eastward. To carry out that order, destruction battalions were formed in frontline areas, having the authority to summarily execute any suspicious person. The destruction battalions burned down villages, schools, and public buildings. As a part of this policy, the Red Army and the Soviet secret police massacred thousands of anti-Soviet prisoners. Stalin answered Hitler's policies in Russia with the same ruthlessness his soldiers were showing. For the Russian authorities, it was imperative to give Germans a taste of their own medicine. Soviet authorities did not punish and sometimes actually encouraged brutality against the German prisoners. They were not committing war crimes nor violating international treaties, but barely doing a service to the motherland by erasing the fascist pigs from the land. With the advancement of the war, the political administration of the Red Army tried to limit the practice of killing prisoners, as they could be valuable sources of intelligence that could be used against the enemy. But their efforts were fruitless. In battle, Red Army men and commanders did not bother capturing soldiers and officers. There are known cases of captives that were strangled and stabbed to death with knives of bayonets. Seeing that they could not stop their soldiers from murdering captured Germans, the Red Army chose to take an administrative approach, asking officers to at least make an inventory of the weapons and personal belongings taken from the dead Nazis. This is another reason why the Eastern Front was the bloodiest of all battlegrounds in World War II. Mass executions of Soviet prisoners in German hands. One of the most harrowing aspects of the awful treatment received by Soviet soldiers in the Eastern Front is the fact that some of them were deliberately separated and subjected to even worse tortures. From early in the Eastern Front campaign, frontline Wehrmacht units had been transferring political commissars, Jews, and suspected subversives to SS formations and the secret police. These men were taken away from camps and executed, sometimes within hours. Screenings also cost an unknown number of Muslims their lives through being taken for Jews, either because they had been circumcised or because they looked Semitic. The fate of those selected had been sealed by the directives of Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office. But for the camps inside the Reich, Heinrich Müller, as head of the Gestapo, determined that the execution should take place in the nearest concentration camp and thus well away from the public gaze. Most of these early victims were killed almost immediately and never registered in the camps to which they were sent, but their plight could not go entirely unnoticed. The transports that took these poor men to the concentration camps contained so many dead or dying men that on the 9th of November 1941, Müller ordered them to stop the transportation in order to preserve the reputation of the SS with the German public. At the same time, killing in certain concentration camps had become commonplace. In September and October 1941, more than 10,000 prisoners of war were killed at Sachsenhausen because they were deemed to be in one of the categories slated for summary extermination. That is, Russian officers, Jews, Soviet political commissars, or communist intellectuals. To make the killing faster, the SS built a special facility so that on arrival the prisoners were incarcerated in 4 barrack blocks with the windows blacked out well away from the rest of the camp. From there they were taken in small groups to the execution block, which was made to look like a medical facility where the men were forced to undress and then conducted individually to a physician who supposedly examined them, but was in reality checking for gold fillings in the teeth. The victim was then taken to a smaller room and shot in the back of the neck. The bodies were removed by kapos from the camp and burned in mobile crematoria while the room was hosed down ready for the next victim. The facility was in almost constant use and could kill between 300 and 350 victims a day until its operations were halted by a typhus epidemic. Similar systems were adopted in Mauthausen and Buchenwald, but other camps chose to use more traditional methods so that prisoners sent to Dachau and Flossenburg were killed on nearby shooting ranges and then cremated. Killings at the Flossenburg camp were halted when blood and body parts appeared on the riverbank in the nearby village, and also at Gross-Rosen because of rumors spreading among the local population. Here, shooting was replaced by lethal injection. At Auschwitz, the first transports with prisoners from the Eastern Front arrived in July 1941, and the captives were taken to nearby gravel pits where they either died from exhaustion, were shot by the SS, or were killed by the kapos within a few days. On September 3rd, a transport of 600 Soviet prisoners was augmented by 250 Poles taken from the camp hospital and used to test the efficacy of Zyklon B gas as a killing method. However, by mid-September, the policy towards Russian prisoners had changed, and a Russian labor camp was created, and some translators found from within the camp population. The Germans had decided that it was better to use the workforce of the captured Soviets instead of wasting resources murdering them. The first arrivals were 2,014 men transferred from Lambsdorff on October 7th. Their treatment was brutal, even by the standards of a camp that would become the byword for Nazi atrocities. Arriving at the railway station, they were forced to strip naked and were then plunged in kettles of disinfectant and then forced to run naked, except for their footwear, into the camp. There had been an overnight frost and there was snow on the ground. A long-winded registration process took place in the open air before they were allowed into the barracks, but clothes were not provided for several days and blankets took even longer. Before the end of October, around 8,000 further prisoners arrived and were accommodated in 9 barracks segregated from the rest of the camp. In November, they were all screened and 8,000 of the 9,000 were classified as not politically suspect and only 300 as fanatical communists. These were the first to be killed. Put to work on projects within the camp like building more extermination facilities, the prisoners succumbed to malnutrition, cold, insanitary conditions, and the brutality of their guards. Some of them were made to walk to nearby villages in temperatures of -35 degrees Celsius to work, later returning with corpses in the evening, and some suffering from frostbite. Their food ration was less than the civilian camp inmates, which meant that even without the brutality, the prisoners would quickly starve. In the following 2 years, only small numbers of prisoners were brought to Auschwitz, mainly to be liquidated because they were too ill to work. Altogether, it has been estimated that 15,000 Red Army prisoners were taken to Auschwitz, of whom 12,000 were registered. In the final registration before the camp was evacuated, only 92 were still alive. Gas was also used in other camps, and Mauthausen began construction of a gas chamber that was first used in May 1942. Until then, mobile gas vans were brought into service, both there and at Sachsenhausen, and again some of their victims were Soviet prisoners. A few prominent Soviet prisoners were also housed at Sachsenhausen. including Lieutenant Yakov Djugashvili, Stalin's son, who had been captured on July 16, 1941, and who was held in a special enclosure with Molotov's nephew and 4 British prisoners of war until he ended his own life by running at the fence and being shot by the guards. Those who survived: use and abuse of Soviet prisoners. Many Soviet prisoners were spared the brutal treatment of the officers and Jews, but not because the Germans considered them more decent. It was because they needed them for forced labor. It had always been anticipated that captured Russian soldiers would be used as a labor force, but exclusively within occupied territory. However, as early as the spring of 1941, the Ministry of Labor had estimated that the German war economy would need 800,000 more workers by the end of that year. Thus, camp managers were ordered to stop murdering those prisoners who were fit for work immediately. This change of policies was forced by the fact that Hitler's initial predictions about the Russian invasion were wrong. The Nazi army met with a stronger resistance than they expected, and the war effort was straining Germany's economy. They needed as many workers as they could get, and Russian labor was considered more dependable than the rest of the Eastern European workforce. This decision was met with resistance from within, as many Nazi Party and SS leaders objected to importing these Bolsheviks into the territory of the Reich. A new set of rules was issued regarding Soviet prisoners so that their contact with German civilians would be minimized and their conditions of work carefully controlled. Ideological objections were put aside and compromises made so that Soviet labor could be made productive, but issuing orders of this nature could not instantly change the appalling conditions being experienced by the Red Army soldiers in German hands. The German word for these prisoner-of-war camps, where Soviet soldiers were sent to provide free labor to the German state, was Stalag, short for Stammlager or base camps. Around 1,000 stalags were in operation in Germany during World War II. The ill-prepared nature of the camps planned to accommodate the expected prisoners meant that from the beginning the overcrowding in these compounds was severe and more prisoners were being shipped in all the time. It was assumed that the Russians would be kept separate from prisoners of other nationalities and well away from contact with German civilians. Food rations were restricted to the point where they merely exacerbated the already poor health of men who had previously been confined in atrocious conditions in the assembly points and primary holding camps. At the camp of Bergen-Belsen, a loaf of bread was split between 10 men, and the soup provided was little more than water. Soon all the grass, leaves, and tree bark had disappeared from the compound, and disease was rife. Yet despite their poor condition, the prisoners were put to work. By October 1941, Stalag Wietzendorf had 70 work detachments all over northern and western Germany, amounting to 65% of the total nominal camp population of 28,000. They were used in a range of construction tasks, including the explosives factory complex at Liebenau, as well as road, railway, and fortification building and forestry. By the 1st of October 1941, there were 112,400 in some form of work across the country, and a month later, the Reich Labor Ministry recorded 390,000 Soviet prisoners, of whom 225,000 were working. However, their physical condition was usually so bad that the German guards had doubts if they could even carry a shovel, let alone do hard work for 10 hours a day. The guards, as well as civilian foremen that supervised the work, would brutally beat the workers, expecting that this would increase their productivity, but in reality, it did exactly the opposite. It was then concluded that the only way to get acceptable levels of productivity from the Russians was to improve their rations. Even the Reich Labor Ministry admitted that perhaps 2/3 of these men were not fit for work as a result of serious malnutrition. Prisoners died in droves in camps inside the Reich. In Stalag 3A alone, there were an estimated 20,000 deaths in the winter of 1941, as a result of poor conditions, the severe weakness of the men when they arrived in the camp, and a ration regime that remained below starvation levels. Even men who had reached these camps in relatively good health were reduced to walking skeletons within 2 or 3 weeks. Overall, it seems that it took a long time for the German authorities to realize the labor potential of the Soviet prisoners, and even longer for them to make material changes to their conditions in the form of better food and accommodation. The mortality statistics bear witness to the lack of real reform before many hundreds of thousands more had been sacrificed through ill treatment and starvation. Survival depended to a large extent on location and employment, and probably an element of luck. Agriculture and farming were inherently much safer than work in the mines, but the attitudes of employers and the German armed forces could also make a material and sometimes critical difference. Of course, when German foremen and guards gave Soviet prisoners a decent treatment, it was not because they thought they deserved it, but because they wanted to keep them fit for work. Even when guards and foremen did not abuse the prisoners, they still died often due to several infectious diseases that were common in the stalags. This also helped the Germans avoid being blamed for these deaths. In the post-war era, it became common to blame the mass deaths of Soviet prisoners in camps in the Reich on typhus epidemics. This served to exonerate the German officers supposedly responsible for their welfare by blaming disease rather than any other cause. Far more prevalent among all the prisoners than typhus was dysentery, something which they had acquired in the collection points during the summer and autumn and before their arrival in the Reich. Medical help was minimal for the huge numbers of sick and wounded crammed into these camps, and even when doctors were available, they had no resources to call on to treat their charges. Coupled with the deliberate segregation of commissars, Jews and Russian intellectuals, and the random shootings of so-called escapees and resistors, mass deaths were a feature of Soviet prisoner of war life long before the transports into the Reich began. Heroic resistance among captured Soviets. Within this general state of malnutrition, brutality and sickness, resistance may seem almost impossible. Furthermore, prisoners returning to the Soviet Union were met with distrust and even punished, as Stalin considered that any captured soldier was a coward and a traitor to the motherland. However, there were enough recorded instances of Soviet prisoners fighting back that deserve being commented. There was at least one mass breakout from a camp in occupied Poland as early as 1941, which was blamed on the halting of transport to the Reich, a severe typhus epidemic, inadequate food, and lengthy screening by the security services. In January 1942, the security services supposedly foiled a revolt at a military hospital in Minsk, and later that year there were reports of mass escapes in East Prussia and of the German army offering bounties 10 Reichsmarks to civilians for every prisoner they helped recapture. Escape was foolhardy and only probably considered as a last resort, considering the penalties for being caught and the bleak future they faced when returning to Stalin's Soviet Union. Nevertheless, by the winter of 1942, there were organized groups in several stalags and work commandos, and escape attempts became more common. One group of Russians found a blank pass for civilians and filled it with the details of those prisoners who spoke fluent German. After forging the necessary stamps, some of them managed to simply leave the camp. One prisoner, who kept his identity secret, Alexei O., was forced to work in the mines near Essen. There, he made friends with a German villager who helped him escape. Returning to the Soviet Union was not a possibility, and initially he wanted to reach Switzerland, but on the way he met a German woman who found him work with a local farmer. He then stayed unmolested until the end of the war. One of the more remarkable instances of resistance carried out by Soviet prisoners was their role in the uprising at Sobibor on 14 October 1943. Although the escape was first conceived by civilian work prisoners in the camp led by Leon Fellhendler, he was assisted by Lieutenant Alexander Pechersky and several other Soviet prisoners of war who had been sent there from Minsk in September 1943. Pechersky, who was originally from Kremenchug in Ukraine, had been captured around the town of Vyazma in October 1941, but survived the first winter of the war in captivity. Attempting to escape in May 1942, he was recaptured and sent to a prison camp at Borisov, where screening discovered that he had been circumcised. It is unknown how he managed to stay alive at this point. On 20 August 1943, he and others were sent to a punishment camp on Sherikaya Street in Minsk, and then put on a transport to Sobibor with other Jewish prisoners of war and civilians. Having survived so long in German captivity, this should have sealed his fate. But against all the odds, he and some of his fellow prisoners of war were not gassed on arrival but selected to join the so-called work prisoners. Their arrival at Sobibor provided a new impetus and crucial military expertise which Fellhendler was able to harness for the uprising in the camp. According to Fellhendler's plan, he would attempt to kill as many Germans as he could on Sobibor. Meanwhile, some of his fellow inmates would make a run for freedom. He calculated that maybe 10 or 15 could escape this way, before he was finally shot by the German guards. When the plan finally came to happen, it was Pechersky who led the revolt, and it was the Soviet prisoners who took on the key role of killing the German guards and taking their weapons. What followed was a mass escape in which many were killed, but Pechersky and his group of 8 Russians and 9 civilians managed to get clear of the camp. Soon afterwards, Pechersky and 8 surviving fellow prisoners of war abandoned the Jewish civilians and made their way across the river Bug, intending to travel eastwards. Having the advantage of speaking Russian, they managed to gain enough local intelligence to find a safe point to cross the river, and ultimately achieved their aim of joining a partisan group that was eventually incorporated into the Red Army. Despite having shown incredible courage and patriotism, immediately rejoining the fight against the Germans instead of going into hiding, Pechersky's role in the uprising was never recognized by the Soviet Union, and after the war he was imprisoned for several months because he had worked for the Germans. An even more spectacular escape, albeit very late in the war, was successfully carried out by Mikhail Devyatayev, a Soviet fighter pilot shot down in July 1944 and ultimately sent as a laborer to work on the airfield at Peenemünde. Here he became familiar with the takeoff procedures of the Heinkel He 111, a German medium bomber plane. On 8 February 1945, he and 9 others attacked the only guard in the airfield and stole an aircraft. Devyatayev flew towards the Russian lines, but was shot at by his own side and carried out a forced landing. While all the escapees survived, the Russian counterintelligence agency refused to believe their stories and they were imprisoned. Devyatayev remained in jail and was only released later, while his 9 fellow escapees were consigned to punishment battalions, and only 3 survived the assault on Berlin. Sabotage actions were also relatively rare, again because of the draconian penalties for those who were caught, but again, some organizations did emerge, often facilitated by medical personnel who had greater freedom of movement. For example, Stalag Fallingbostel gave rise to the Committee for the Struggle Against Fascism. It included Belgian, French, and Yugoslav elements, and was able to link prisoners in many different work commandos within the ambit of the home camp. Its members were credited with a number of sabotage actions, for example, derailing the lifting cranes and disabling the electric ovens at the Hanover manufacturing plant, which made parts for Tiger tanks. Likewise, Franco-Russian cooperation was credited with shutting down the turbine at the factory near Braunschweig that produced torpedoes and amphibious landing craft. Non-Russians were generally in a better position to acquire maps, money, compasses, and food for potential escapes, and the French also provided a radio. Links were also made with anti-fascist German soldiers who again provided links and sometimes materials from the outside world. In the early part of 1944, the Fallingbostel Group's existence was uncovered by the Gestapo, and many of its leaders killed or sent to concentration camps. Similar organizations were evident in other camps. For example, in Stalag Sena, the chief physician, Alexis, was at the center of a resistance network inside the camp. He and his colleagues deliberately hid men in a camp hospital, and on some occasions used the removal of bodies from the camp to swap papers, so that those being sought were given new identities and their former selves registered as dead. There were estimates that this group grew to 1,400 or 1,500 members by the end of 1943. In September 1944, a report noted that German informers had identified a secret organization within the camp based around the camp hospital, aimed at subversion and sabotage at the workplace and the organization of mass escapes and armed resistance. Soviet soldiers made to fight for Germany. The Germans lost up to 800,000 men either killed, wounded, or missing in the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, and the manpower shortfalls were overcome in part by the recruitment of prisoners of war as auxiliary troops attached to German commands. Estimates suggest that the prisoners may have constituted up to 40% of these units by the end of 1941. Why did the Soviet prisoners of war volunteer in such large numbers? Probably the most important factor, given the appalling conditions in which these men were kept, was the possibility of receiving sufficient food and shelter to survive. This may have been augmented by a lack of commitment to either communism or Russia, or both, as well as knowledge of Stalin's orders regarding captured soldiers. Despite Hitler's intransigence, It seems that some military commanders would appropriate captured Red Army personnel into their formations without ever declaring them as prisoners of war or having them processed as such. In this way, unit strengths could be maintained in the face of mounting losses and an absence of ready replacements. The integration of these so-called Eastern troops into the German army took on substantial proportions, with more than 200,000 reported in the spring of 1942 and 573,000 by the end that year. By December 1943, it was estimated that there were approximately 800,000 Russians wearing German uniforms. These Eastern troops included large numbers of Ukrainians and Belarusians, many of whom had no love for Moscow or for Soviet communism, but who had nonetheless been drafted into the Red Army. Later in the war, as the manpower situation worsened, Hitler authorized the recruitment of soldiers from among the Soviet minorities into designated national units as so-called Eastern Legions. The most virulent anti-Soviets encountered by the Germans were the Cossacks, and as early as the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht had established a Cossack division within the SS, which saw active service but was largely used in anti-partisan operations. In 1944, Cavalry General Peter Krasno, the 72-year-old leader of the Don Cossacks, was made leader of Cossack troops. By the end of that year, 5 regiments with a strength of around 5,000 Cossacks had been enlisted. Some of these first recruits came from the ranks of the prisoners of war. They were deployed primarily in anti-partisan warfare in Yugoslavia, where they gained a reputation for brutality. There were also Ukrainians that fought under German military command at Kharkov and Stalingrad, and a Turkish division established with around 50% German soldiers and augmented by some Azerbaijanis. In addition, the SS itself established a Galician division composed largely of Ukrainians in April 1943. Although deployed on the Eastern Front, these units were latterly transferred to other theaters of operations, with many ending the war in Italy or elsewhere in Western Europe. In each case, a proportion of the men in these units had previously been prisoners in German captivity. War on the Eastern Front was, according to Adolf Hitler, primarily a clash of ideologies: Nazism against communism and the German Aryan race against the subhuman Slavic Russians. After 15 years of anti-Bolshevik propaganda, it was no surprise that the captured Soviet soldiers suffered some of the worst punishments imaginable. At first, Hitler's orders were to exterminate as many Russians as possible, but thanks to the heroic resistance of the Russian soldiers and the poor performance of the German army in Soviet territory, the prisoners of war were put to work in order to sustain the war effort. Millions of Russian soldiers were unceremoniously killed, beaten to death, or worked to exhaustion, leaving the harsh Russian winter to do the rest. The cruelties suffered by these people are among the most heinous crimes committed by the Third Reich, and are a reminder of the power of political propaganda.